we're doing some work, and by we, I mean other people are working on our website, Wallula's website, to sort of optimize, the allowing people to find the website easy and being able to search for Wallula and locate the church and find out what we're all about on our online. So optimizing our online presence. And it got me thinking, what are the most searched terms on Google? And so I did a little research, and I thought, maybe potentially this could be dangerous research, but it wasn't so much, and so that's good. And I just found out all sorts of things. Like the most searched terms are sort of directional terms, like, how do I access YouTube? So YouTube every year is one of the top search terms on Google. Or the weather ranks very high, which concerns me because by the time you search on Google, you could look out the window and find out what the weather is. But weather is searched high on Google every year. It's a most searched term. Occasionally, there are different reasons. Maybe the season has something to do with it. Sports stuff we might think that the Super Bowl would be a highly searched term, and maybe it was, but in 2025, the most searched sporting event in the world was a cricket match between India and England. And so, you have to figure that out and find out where that cricket is going down and all that stuff. So, a highly searched term in the sports world. In 2025, kind of political events or current events, the tragedy of assassination of Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was a highly searched name in 2025. All sorts of terms get searched, but over the last 5 years, ranking very high every one of those years was the term hope. Now, sometimes there's specific reasons that terms might get searched. Like in 2008, there was a kind of worldwide economic downturn, and the term prayer was a highly searched term in 2008. Or in 2020, in March of 2020, the term faith was highly searched. As the world kind of collectively lost its mind and we weren't sure what to do, we were searching for, what can we have faith in. But over the last 5 years, consistently the word hope has been a highly searched term on Google. Now the data kind of ends there. We're not sure, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're full of hope? Or does it mean that we're kind of grasping for hope? And maybe as you take in consideration everything else that's going on in the world, and there's no shortage of reasons perhaps for us to be discouraged by world events and even decisions that world leaders make, and even in our own nation, I suppose there's lots of reasons that maybe we ought to be discouraged. It lends me to believe that maybe people are reaching, are searching, are grasping for hope a little bit. This article that I read about hope being a much searched for term on Google said the ongoing years-long trend of searching for hope suggests that something is different. That people are just looking for hope, for encouragement. It occurred to me that as followers of Jesus, that we have every reason to be encouraged. And kind of no matter, there's lots of reasons to be discouraged in the world around us. Maybe you're going through a situation in your life, sort of specific to you, and relationships that you're dealing with, or health issues, or a job situation, all kinds of stuff. Sometimes life throws us curveballs, and we can find ourselves in sort of a position where we feel discouraged, where we feel like we're lacking hope. But as followers of Jesus, kind of no matter where we find ourselves, we can be encouraged. And I think here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 7, and we'll read our way through the end of the chapter, verses 7 through 18. I think Paul highlights for us 3 truths that offer us great hope and encouragement. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I'm going to begin reading in verse 7, and we'll read through the end of the chapter here. 3 truths that offer us hope and encouragement. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Verse 7, this is what God's word says. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed, and so I spoke. We also believe, and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. All right, three tremendous truths here that ought to offer us hope and encouragement. Truth number one is that God sustains us. Look at verse 7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Paul talks about this treasure in jars of clay, and I suppose we have to unpack this analogy a little bit, and just to be clear, that the treasure that Paul is talking about is the gospel, the good news, the story of Jesus, and the jars of clay, well, that's us. Maybe Paul has in mind specifically our physical bodies. He's going to go on, and we're going to kind of talk about that a little more as we get our way through the end of the chapter here, but I really think he just has in mind people, that God has this huge story, this really good news that he sent Jesus into the world. And when we say yes to Jesus, we have this hope for all of eternity in him. That this good news that Paul describes as the surpassing power of God at work in our lives, this really, really, really big news. And it's contained in us. That we're the carriers, we're the storytellers. We have access to this good news, and we can share that with others around us. This idea of putting treasure in jars of clay. In the first century, sometimes people in their homes, they would hide really valuable items in ordinary packages, in pottery and jars of clay, kind of everyday items of usage. That the idea being twofold. One, that potential robbers wouldn't look for the valuable stuff in pots and pans. That sort of idea. And secondly, if you collected so much, you kind of put it in, and maybe your junk drawer is a little like this. Once in a while it's hard to get open. You find yourself, you've accumulated lots of treasures. Well, maybe if you accumulate lots of treasures in one jar and you really needed that fast, the payment was due, the bank loan was being called, and you needed access to that, well, you could just break the jar and have access to the treasure. The jar wasn't that important. The treasure was what was inside it, what was really, really valuable. Experts today say that if you have valuables in your home, you ought to hide them not in like portable safes or anywhere near windows or doors, but the same idea they encourage people to use. Maybe put them in ordinary storage boxes and label it Christmas lights or summer clothes. The idea being that the potential thieves are smart enough to stay away from Christmas lights. Well, the analogy here is that there's something really valuable that each one of us has access to and that we can share. And Paul here describes this treasure, this good news of Jesus, as having surpassing power. That word power is an important one to Paul. It's used 118 times in all of the New Testament, 60 times by the Apostle Paul. Over and over he talks about God's power. In the Greek Old Testament, that same word was used to describe the parting of the Red Sea when Moses led the nation of Israel out of captivity in Egypt. The Greek Old Testament says that God parted that sea, that the water stood still. Why? So that the world could see the power of God. It's described in the Gospels, it's used in the Gospels rather, to describe the miracles of Jesus. That Jesus displayed this dunamis, that's the Greek word there for power in his life and the miracles that he performed. Dunamis it's this word that really just exemplifies kind of an explosive, this really big power. In the 1860s, Alfred Nobel was working and performing some studying nitroglycerin and doing some experiments with that, and they didn't go well. In fact, his factory eventually blew up, and with it, his younger brother and 4 other men who was working with him. He lost 5 people in this explosion. It was a big enough scandal that the government shut down his studies. They said, you can't do this anymore, it's just way too dangerous. And so he moved his lab, his studies, his experiments offshore to a boat. And eventually he came to realize that this very volatile liquid, nitroglycerin, you could calm it down when it was mixed with dry components. And he had this great invention. An invention that would allow people to mine and literally move mountains. Eventually, he's got to decide, how do I market this and what do I name this? So he goes back into classic literature. He finds this word dunamis, this idea of power. And he kind of transliterates that word, and we have dynamite, invented in 1867. And that idea of sort of an explosion, this big power, is what Paul has in mind here with the power of God. In fact, he goes a step further here, doesn't he? He says this surpassing power. And that means just what it sounds like. It means it's more than enough power. I remember as a kid, or a long time ago, I suppose I wasn't a kid, watching this old TV show, Home Improvement. There was a character on the show, he was this home improvement fix-it guy, and his wife would ask him to do different chores, maybe install a dishwasher. And Tim the Toolman Taylor, he wouldn't just install a dishwasher, he would say, this needs more power, and then grunt. This more power, it was more than enough. It always ended in hilarious shenanigans, didn't it? Because it was surpassing power. It was more than enough power. Here, Paul says, man, this power of God working in your life is more than enough to do make all the changes, to do all the stuff I'm going to talk about as we go through the end of the chapter. Paul says that it was more than enough power to raise Jesus from the dead. In fact, he says it raised Jesus from the dead, and it will raise each one of us in the same way from the dead. The surpassing power of God at work in our lives. Goes on in verse 8 to say, look, right now I know you might not get it. He says, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. This idea of being afflicted, that Greek word means to be pressed in on. It's the idea of sort of being in a crowd. You remember the last really big crowd you were in, maybe trying to navigate your way through, and it just seemed like people were pressing in on you all around you. It's the same word that's used in Mark chapter 3 when Jesus is preaching and the crowd gets so big that he says to Peter, Peter, can I get in your boat? Can we put out a little ways? Because I feel afflicted, pressed in on. He said, man, we're pressed all around us, afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed. That Greek word has in mind not sort of physical hurt or affliction, but mental anguish. It literally means no exit or no resources. It's the idea of facing these questions without any real answers. Paul says we're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're persecuted. That Greek word literally has in mind a hunter pursuing his prey. Just keeps going and going and going until he finally captures, kills that animal. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. We might say we're knocked down, but not out. Paul says we can go through these hurtful, painful, discouraging situations because God's power is enough to keep us going. By the way, there's real light at the end of the tunnel, Paul says. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. Where we're dealing with the same kinds of hurts and struggles and persecution that maybe Jesus experienced, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Because even as we face these discouraging situations, these tough times in life, even as we face maybe even somebody persecuting us, as was the case with Paul. You can look, there's a couple lists in 2 Corinthians. One in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and then again in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And the best list is in chapter 11. I think it starts in about verse 23, about verses 23 to 29. You can read about, Paul just lists out, I was shipwrecked a couple times. I was beaten this many times within an inch of my life. I was in danger when I traveled. I was in danger when I stayed in one place too long. I was in danger from enemies, and sometimes my friends were really my enemies. And he finally ends by saying, and on top of all of that, I'm constantly worried about all of you. I deal with this anxiety from all these churches that I started, and I just want the best for you. Paul says over and over and over, he's afflicted, he's persecuted, but he's not left alone, he's not crushed, he's not forsaken. He's struck down but not destroyed, because the life of Jesus, this surpassing power of God, is at work in his life. And by the way, even when he struggles, it's worth it, because that surpassing power of God can be at work in the folks that he's sharing that story of Jesus with. It's worth it all to get this story out, Paul says. The life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. I met with a friend this week, and we'd intended to get together some time before. He said, man, I really need to talk to you. And so we worked out a time and met for coffee, and he just laid out the last several months of his life. And he said, I was just going through this really hard time, this really dark time, and I don't mean this. It turned out okay because we're sitting there and we're having breakfast, and so I know he's okay, and so I'm sharing this story. It sounds a little funny, but it's not. It's terrible. He said, I had this exit strategy to get out of everything, to be done with it all. He said, my dog was sick, and I thought if my dog goes, I'll go with him. I said, well, what happened? What changed? And he told me this. He said, I just decided I needed to be back in church. I needed to be a part of God's family. I needed to open the Bible and do some of the things that I know I should have been doing all the time. And it was just such an encouragement. I think maybe if you're dealing with some of those emotions, you're in kind of that stage, you're really afflicted in that way, pressed in on in life. There's some other things that I would suggest too, but man, what a great place to start. That this power of God, that it's not just something that Paul talked about. This dunamis power of God, surpassing power of God at work in our lives. It's not just something for Bible times. And he's really at work in our lives today. This surpassing power of God we can experience, this life that is truly life that Jesus promises is available to each and every one of us, that God really, truly sustains us. Truth number 2 is that we're raised like Jesus. Look at verse 11. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Paul kind of continues this conversation. And essentially this idea of being given over to death, that's the same language that's used to describe Jesus' journey to the cross in the Gospels, that Jesus was given over to death on the cross. And here Paul is saying that I sort of experience that same sort of suffering that Jesus did. That when he's afflicted, when he's persecuted, when he's perplexed, that he's experiencing those same ups and downs that Jesus experienced in life. That the sacrifice that he's going through, though, he says is worth it. Because even as I'm being given over to death, even as I'm carrying around this death in my life, it's so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So that this life can be found in you. In other words, this sacrifice that I'm enduring is really, really worth it. Because you can find Jesus, because you can experience Jesus. I think Paul or God invites us into the same sort of experience, this theology of suffering that Paul's kind of mapping out here. Man, we can employ in our lives. And I think God calls us to this. I'm going to say some things, and I'm not contending. Again, you got to go read 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Go read that list of struggles and hardship that Paul goes through. Right? Because I'm going to say some things, and I'm not really comparing the two, all right? Because, look, I think God calls us to sacrifice. And one of the ways he does that is just by serving him and serving others. And we've been talking about ministry teams. And we want to invite you to be a part of this ministry team dinner next Sunday at 11:45. Come have some tacos, meet ministry team leaders, figure out where Jesus can use you and where you can serve at Wallula Christian Church and in our community. And the truth is that every one of those ministry teams, every one of those acts of service require some kind of sacrifice. You know, I think about serving in the Shelter of Hope. We staff that shelter on Monday nights and Tuesday mornings. Some of those times are not convenient. You know, it's overnight. There's shifts. Man, that third shift really gets to me. You know, it's rough. It's not easy. It's not convenient. There's a little sacrifice. We like to come to worship on Sunday mornings at worship time, right? There are folks in here before filling up these communion trays, putting cards on the chairs, making sure that everything was set and ready for us to express our love to Jesus on a Sunday morning. Ready to worship him. There's a little piece of sacrifice there. Now, I'm not comparing that sacrifice to what Paul was enduring or going through, but the principle is kind of the same. God calls us to this being willing to sacrifice for him. And what's more, while the sacrifice is different, the benefit, the payoff, the same. It's sort of amazing to think about how this little act of kindness, how this small sacrifice on our part might lead somebody to make a life-changing, eternity-changing decision for Jesus. Man, the sacrifice, I suppose, changes, but the benefit, the end result, the reason that Paul says this is all worth it, the same. We get to find this new life in Jesus. Paul goes on in verse 13 to say, since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke. We also believe and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. Paul says, he quotes Psalm 116, I believed and so I spoke. He's just reaffirming this truth that has always been, that if we believe that God is faithful, if we believe that Jesus is who he says he is, if we believe that what we believe is really true, man, we have to get to a place where we're willing to share that. This good news, this surpassing power of God that we're carrying around in these jars of clay, we have to be willing to share that story. Now, I think that this story is shared best in relationship. That sometimes folks will kind of, kind of get in a situation where they think, man, I got to shout this good news out in kind of the wide open air or whatever, and it just bounces off of people. I'm reminded of the story, an author tells this story. He says it's true. I can't imagine this is a true story. Don't do this. But he said his buddy in college was writing a paper or something, and he wanted to conduct this experiment. They were going to college in Phoenix, and at the time they went to the main drag in downtown Phoenix, and his buddy, his college friend, said, I'm going to just go up and introduce myself to women I meet on this road, and I'm just going to ask them to kiss me. And he wanted to find out how many women it would take before one would kiss him. And so that's what he did. And after being rebuked, rebuffed, slapped a couple of times, finally the 98th woman gave him a kiss. Now, if you apply that sort of statistic to evangelism, there would be folks who would say, man, if you have to be turned down 97 times, that 98th person is worth it. I think this is true. I just wonder, in that little experiment, how much more hardened, how much more standoffish, how much less willing to engage with a stranger on the street were the 97 people before the 98th sort of gave in. All that to say, I think evangelism, I think sharing the story of Jesus is best shared in relationship. But truly, this isn't where most of us struggle. We don't struggle so much with, man, I just can't wait to tell these strangers about Jesus. Most of us struggle with the fact that we've been pouring our lives into folks we really care about. And it's just super hard for us to kind of get to that place where we say, I believe, so I'll speak. Because eventually we still have to kind of say out loud, man, this is the change in my life. This is what's different about me. It's my relationship with Jesus. There's this company I read about from Canada, evidently. It's a company that's called the Digital Frog International. And they basically created this computer program, a 3D animation of a frog. You remember in science class in biology or whatever, as a student in high school or middle school, you had to dissect the frog. And so this Digital Frog International, they have this computer program where you can virtually dissect a frog. And they say the benefits are outstanding, right? That, first of all, when you make a mistake on the digital frog, it's easy to correct. Secondly, no real frogs are harmed in the creation of this 3D frog. And finally, people, the author says, perhaps best of all, students don't have to get their hands dirty. Well, it's just not true when you're sharing the story of Jesus. You can serve and love and pour yourself into that relationship, and that makes a difference. I'm all for it, right? St. Francis of Assisi, we love this quote. Preach the gospel always, use words if necessary. At some point, words probably become necessary. Build the relationship, serve and love, and just love enough to share the gospel. I believe and so I spoke. Oh, why? Because, man, it's really worth it. He goes on, verse 14, saying, knowing that he who raised the Lord, the surpassing power that raised Jesus, will raise us also with Jesus and brings us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. We have this hope that because Jesus raised from the dead, that we will be raised from the dead, that for eternity we will be in his presence. Every Sunday we gather together and we celebrate communion. And when we celebrate that, we say, oh, we're going to share this meal together. We're going to eat this cracker and this cup of juice and represents Jesus' body and his blood. And I want to be really careful here. But I think I mean this. it's a pitiful representation of the celebration, of the feast, of the eternity that we'll spend in the presence of God. I mean, I don't know what you think about as your grandest celebration, as your biggest party. Maybe it'll be a Super Bowl party tonight, right? Man, we're gonna have the best dips and all the best drinks, and there's gonna be a 7-foot sandwich. It doesn't get bigger than that. I mean, 8 feet, but that's besides the point. You think, oh, this celebration is going to be so cool. It just doesn't. There's no comparison to being in the very presence of Jesus. I mean, Revelation talks about heaven, and it talks about the fact that there's no sun, S-U-N, in heaven. Why? Because all the light shines from the sun, S-O-N, from Jesus. There's no churches in heaven. Why? Because the church is in heaven, in the very presence of Jesus. And it just doesn't get better, it doesn't get bigger, and it's so absolutely worth it that the grace of Jesus would extend more and more, so more and more people could hear about Him. Talked a little bit at our Vision 2026 dinner. I said, I think that this year, probably in the fall, Wallula will move from 2 worship services on a Sunday morning to 3 worship services on a Sunday morning. And I'm sitting in an elders meeting, we're kind of chatting about that, and we're talking about what it'll look like, and we still have lots of planning to do, and lots of communication, all those things, and lots of things that have to happen before then. But they're saying, well, we need to really get on this because some people are asking me questions about this. And a few of the elders mentioned this, and I said, really? Because nobody said boo to me. I mean, I kind of say it out loud and just, but they say, no, they're asking, people are asking us questions. And I said, well, what kind of questions? And one of our elders said, well, the biggest question, the most common question is, why? Verse 15, for it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. Ultimately, Wallula Christian Church exists to glorify God by equipping believers and transforming the casual. We want that grace to extend to more and more people. Now, maybe the plans of men will fail miserably. That's a possibility. But man, isn't this story worth a stumble? Isn't the fact that the surpassing power of God raising us from the dead just like Jesus, it's worth getting our hands dirty once in a while? We're raised like Jesus. Truth number 3 is we don't give up. Verse 16, so we do not lose heart. We've come full circle. At the very beginning, verse 1 of chapter 4, Paul talks about the fact that we don't lose heart, that we don't give up. And last week we talked about, well, that reminded me of the story of the persistent widow. Jesus said, I'm telling you this story so that you won't lose heart. And the story is all about prayer. Go back and pray and pray and pray. Spend time with God. Be filled up so that life is made new in us. He's going to talk about it. This outer shell is passing away, but we're being renewed on the inside day by day. How do we do that? Well, we stay in relationship with Jesus. We continue to grow that relationship. We continue to allow the Spirit to work on us from the inside out. And so for me, that begins with prayer. In the next week or so, we're going to start our Easter series in a few weeks. February 18th, though, our Easter reading plan will start. Easter's early. So that's Ash Wednesday. We kind of got to get rolling a little earlier. And so our Easter reading plan will kick off on February 18th. And you can sign up on the Church Center app. You just have to click a button, say, I want to be a part of it. It's going to send you an email. You can download that reading plan. And every week you'll be sent an email with some prayer prompts and just a devotion for that week. And so just to keep you engaged and online, and we can go back to meeting with Jesus over and over and over again, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. We're just renewing that inner self over and over again. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Again, I'd encourage you, just take some time, maybe before you watch the football game this evening, read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, read that list of what Paul describes as light momentary afflictions. It might shift kind of your view of what you're going through right now in life, maybe. He says it's all worth it. The weight of glory is beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, they're passing away, but the things that are unseen are eternal, they last forever. Paul essentially is saying, just shift your focus to what really, really matters. These eternal things, the gospel, sharing that story. I mean, it's so easy to get distracted. I know, I've talked a little bit about it, and this evening I'll watch that football game, the Super Bowl, and we may be thinking about the Super Bowl, or last night I watched some of the Winter Olympics, some of these sports that were going on, and I saw that stuff, and I just know that what really matters is that in 2 days, pitchers and catchers report. Keep your eyes on what really matters. Well, man, all of that stuff is passing away too, right? Paul's saying just keep your heart and mind focused on what really matters, on Jesus. Share that with those around you. Don't give up. We don't have to give up because we can stay engaged and know Jesus more. Just thinking about those Google searches, my son Clayton is going to coach high school baseball, and he knows I like to hear about, they've started some off-season workouts, and I like to hear about the baseball practice. I even like to hear about, just high school baseball practice. So he sent me a text message the other day. He said, this is what happened at the first workout, and he's also coaching middle school basketball, so he wasn't at this workout, but he sent me the list of drills they did or whatever, and one of the drills was a target flank throw. And I sent a text back. I said, Clayton, what's a target flank throw? And he said, I don't really know. And so I received this text message in my office. I'm sitting at my computer, and so I Google target flank throw. And I don't know if this says something about, the algorithm built just for me, but I didn't find out anything about baseball drills. I found out there were some great deals on throw blankets at Target. And you scroll down a little further, and I found great recipes for flank steaks. Right? But nothing about baseball drills. Well, I don't know. I suppose you can search for hope on Google. But man, as followers of Jesus, we know that we can be encouraged because we have access to this relationship with Jesus that lasts forever and ever and ever. Let's make it a little easier for people to search for that hope. Let's stand and worship Him right now.